I'm going to talk today about the internet phenomenon of Wim Winters and the so-called double beat theory. There have been a few commentaries on this on other channels on YouTube, uh, and some of them are more or less polite to Wim Winters. If you don't know about Wim Winters, he runs a channel which is dedicated to this idea, very largely today dedicated to this idea that composers before the modern period used the metronome in a different way to how modern musicians use the metronome. And he claims that they were notating music and they were notating metronome marks in such a way that there are 2 ticks of the metronome to every beat, and a consequence of that is that the metronome numbers on works such as some of Beethoven's works and Chopin's works and others need to be actually halved to get the tempi that the composer intended. And this results in some works that are normally played extremely fast being quite only moderately fast, and works that go at moderate speed going quite slowly, and works that should go slowly going tremendously slowly. And Wim started out by performing, but by being a performer and a musicologist, and performing mostly Baroque and early classical music on authentic instruments, which is very admirable, and he does it very well. But his current obsession with this double beat tempo idea is quite strange and seems to have taken over his channel now. And since it's sometimes mentioned elsewhere, and I've heard it mentioned in real life outside of YouTube, it's a thing that I think I'd like to comment on. And in particular, a recent video of Wim's where he's talking about Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. I will mention that in a moment. But first of all, I'll deal with some other aspects of some other problems with this half tempo or this double beat idea. One of them is that there is really no documentary evidence that supports it at all. And there's a lot of documentary evidence that contradicts it. For example, the original instructions for the use of the metronome published by Maelzel, and I've read them in English, and I guess they were published in other European languages as well, make absolutely clear how the metronome is to be used, and you can find this elsewhere on YouTube, and you can read the original document. It's online, and it's absolutely clear that the instructions are for each tick of the metronome to count as a beat. And there's another point which I don't think anybody else makes, so I'll make it. It occurs to me that if what Wim is saying is true, that actually I think I'm saying his name wrong, it's more like, should be pronounced more like Bim, it's a Dutch name. Anyway, what Wim or Bim is saying, Mr. Winters is saying, is that Maelzel made an instrument, a metronome, a measuring instrument that has a series of numbers on it, and today we believe that those numbers show the number, well they do, they show the number of ticks per minute. That's what the numbers are. A metronome marking of 60 is 60 ticks a minute, and we believe that that indicates 60 beats a minute. But if Wim is or Bim is to be believed, then originally in the time of Beethoven and Czerny and Chopin, the metronome was used counting 2 ticks, 1 to the left, 1 to the right. So that complete cycle of 1 to the left and 1 to the right, that was counted as a beat. Well, why then is the metronome graduated in ticks per minute? Why isn't it graduated in beats per minute? Or if a beat was equal to a cycle from one side to the other, why is it not graduated in cycles per minute? Because that would have made the system right and intuitive then. Then you would have known that if you're counting a beat to the left and a beat to the right, a movement to the left and a movement to the right, in other words, a cycle, what I'm calling a cycle of the metronome, as one beat, then that's the number that you need to know. It's the number of those total movements in a minute that you need to know what tempo you're talking about. So why did he graduate it in ticks per minute if it actually means beats per minute, and a beat is 2 ticks, so the numbers are wrong? So why did Maelzel create an instrument which gives the wrong numbers if this idea of the double beat theory is to be believed? Now, there are many other problems with this theory, one of which is how did the change took place? I mean, this is really the killer. This is the major question, is how did the change take place? If the metronome was being widely read as the markings meaning the markings are the number of ticks, but you actually have 2 ticks to a beat, so each beat is 2 ticks, then how did the convention change to the modern convention? At what stage did it change? How was this change promulgated? How was the message spread out to musicians and teachers and colleges all over the world to suddenly adopt a new convention? We would have a record of that. We would have magazines, we'd have newspapers from the time saying there's been some huge meeting of musicians to discuss how we should do the notation of tempo, and it's been decided that it would have been an international convention. It would have been something like when the Paris Treaty determined that the zero of longitude should pass. It wasn't it was a Washington Treaty actually. They were arguing for a long time whether the zero of longitude should pass through Greenwich or should pass through Washington or could pass through Paris, and it was causing confusion because different countries' navies were adopting a different zero of longitude, so they didn't necessarily know where they were when they were communicating with each other. So they had there was an international convention. They decided that the zero of longitude would pass through Greenwich in England. So to change the convention of the metronome, you'd have had to have some big meeting like that and some tremendous announcement. Now we are going to read the metronome differently to how it was read in the past. And that never happened. There's no record of that. There's no record of the metronome ever being used in a different way to how it is used today and how it is taught today. And most of the so-called evidence that Wim Winters comes up with to support his idea is really along the lines of, well, these composers wrote markings that were tremendously fast, metronome markings that were tremendously fast, particularly the exercises of the many studies of Czerny, who was Beethoven's pupil, and particularly the Etudes of Chopin, and particularly the first movement of Beethoven's Hammer Clavier Sonata in B flat. And it's true, these works do have very fast metronome marks, but they are not unplayable. I can't play them to those speeds, but there are people who can. With a bit of practice, they can achieve those speeds. Those speeds are not unachievable. The claim that they are unachievable is just untrue, and it's easy to check that it is untrue. There are recordings of virtuoso pianists playing some of the Czerny etudes at the actual exact mark speed, and not all these speeds were due to the original composers, by the way, so that's another thing you have to take into account. If you consider these metronome markings to be some sort of gospel truth, they are not. They're often put on by later editors or by publishers, often probably put on by people who didn't really know what they were doing, and the potential for error and things being got completely wrong is enormous. So it's not that surprising that there are metronome markings from these 19th century publications that seem very surprising and indeed hard to play that way. Some of them could well be just mistakes, and others, well, yeah, I mentioned the Chopin Etudes, and it is possible to play them at the marked speeds, and they are etudes. They were meant to develop a very high degree of virtuosity, and clearly that's why Chopin marked them to those levels, to have a high degree of virtuosity indicated on the piece that was the thing to be trained for and to be sought after, to be aspired to. But it's another question to say, well, are they artistically best at those speeds? I would say most probably they're artistically best at a slightly lower speed, maybe 10, 15, 20% lower, and that's how most modern musicians treat them. And this subject is always flexible. It's always got to be flexible depending. The tempo that you adopt has to depend on the instrument. It depends on your own skills as a performer. It depends on the circumstance, the hall, the resonance of the hall. It depends on what other musicians, if there's other musicians involved, what they want, what they can do, how the accommodation works, how the compromises work out. There's nothing absolute about these markings, and musicians use their good sense and judgment to adopt a suitable tempo for the occasion and for the piece. And there's really nothing absolute about these markings. Then there's no, one of the major problems with Wim Winters' channel is the way he's calling everything authentic now and claiming that the way he is performing these works, which is approximately almost half the speed that they are normally played, is he's claiming that that is authentic, that is what the composer wanted, and that's the genuine way to do it. And that is a very problematic claim, because these things are never absolute. Whether you think his theory of the two beats, the two ticks to one beat, is probable in any way, which is I'm convinced it is not a probable idea, or whether you want to perform them at the literally at the marked speeds, it's still the case that it has to be adaptable, and instruments are different to how they were in the past. In particular, the piano, we're talking mainly about piano music here, mainly keyboard music. The modern piano is far more resonant, a far weightier instrument than the earlier forte piano, and even a far different instrument to the instruments that Chopin was playing and Liszt was playing certainly early on in his career. The evolution of the piano during the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, when the iron frame was invented, when steel strings were universally adopted, when other gadgets within the piano to increase the resonance and sonority, like the agraphs, the little stops on the strings which generate extra portions of the strings that resonate sympathetically with the rest of the string. All these changes in technology and materials, techniques of construction, completely transform the instrument, and therefore it's a different instrument, and the tempi that the original composers considered appropriate might well be considered completely inappropriate now, or much less. They may be harder to achieve as well, because the heavier action on the modern piano, it may be much harder to achieve extreme fast tempi. So that's another thing to say about it. Another thing to say about it is that we do have recordings from the early part of the 20th century of virtuoso pianists who are quite close to the period in question. They were not Chopin's pupils, but they were pupils of Chopin and of Czerny, and even we have recordings by some pupils of Liszt. And so we got a pretty good idea from the way that they played how people were playing in the mid-19th century and how their teachers were playing. And the performances are similar, the speeds are similar to how it would be played today. There's an early recording from I think the 1920s of a Frenchman called Planté. I think it's Planté, and he actually heard Chopin playing when he was about 12 years old. He actually heard Chopin playing, and he survived into the recording age. He was a great French virtuoso, and you can hear on YouTube, you can hear him playing Opus 10 number 4 in C sharp minor by Chopin, very famous study. And it's not at Chopin's tempo marking, but it's not far short. It's certainly not at half speed, and he was obviously old when he did this recording, so presumably past his best. You will notice if you listen to it that the tempo is really pulled about all over the place, rubato in a way that we wouldn't consider tasteful today. But it's certainly not slow. And there are lots of other examples of recordings from people in this period who are quite close to the period that we're talking about. And they're playing at the speed that people play today, or even trying to play faster. And these were generally old men when they did these recordings. So that is very strong evidence against that musical tempi haven't really changed that much, if at all. And most of the evidence seems to be that things have got slower as instruments have got more sonorous, and orchestras have got bigger, and it's harder to control a bigger number of people. I think this is also another thing about this. It just seems like another version of a traditional human folly, which is to say things were different in the past. It was more relaxed before technology, and everybody was polite and well behaved, and you didn't have all this crime, and everything went slowly, and life was nice. It was just another version of this eternal human idea to think of the past as somehow sylvan and fundamentally different, and human life was relaxed and slower. It's just another version of that myth. In fact, humans haven't changed. The human frame works the same way. The human body and the human brain works the same way as it always did. Yes, we've got technology today, but in many ways that has probably had the reverse effect. I mean, people had to run about a lot more in the past. They had to be fit to survive. Most of them could probably move faster than most of the people sitting in their armchairs and sitting in their cars most of the time today. People were active, and people were energetic in the past. You only have to look at the vast oeuvres of some of those composers who had very short lives, like Mozart and Schubert and Mendelssohn, who composed these vast oeuvres of work in very short period. They were tremendously active. People achieved a lot in very short times. They had to do things quickly in the past. So this idea that everything was slow in the past, this is just a romantic nonsense. So to come on to my main point, which is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Well, the reason for this is that Wim made this video comparing his performance of Moonlight Sonata with one by well-known virtuoso and YouTube personality Valentina Lisitsa, if that's the right way to pronounce it. And his version obviously is about half the speed of her version, and he points out that when she gets to the climax and very near the end of the last movement, which is bar 163 to 164, where the music breaks into the music which generally had an accompaniment in semiquavers. The notes break into demi-semiquavers, and there are also pauses on the end of those bars, and it's a very famous moment. So that's this moment when this movement, which has been this hyperactive perpetuum mobile up to that point, comes crashing to a halt in those fast notes, which are in handfuls and then turn into the sustained chords at the end of those bars. So Wim points out that Valentina slows her demi-semiquavers down to approximately the speed of his demi-semiquavers in his performance, even though she had started the movement playing the quavers at twice the semiquavers at twice the speed that he was playing his. So his argument is that, oh, it's impossible to play what Beethoven written. It's impossible to play those demi-semiquavers. Therefore, the tempo that he's adopting, his half-speed, double-beat tempo, is the correct one, because otherwise you can't play these notes when these demi-semiquavers come. It's not possible, and Beethoven doesn't write on the music any different speed at that point, any different tempo at that point. So he claims there's an inconsistency here. Well, I think this is obvious to anybody who's familiar with Beethoven's style and the classical style, that this isn't the case, that a fixed tempo rendition of this music is nonsensical. This is a moment which is like a cadenza. It is typical of Beethoven's writing. The similar passages in many of Beethoven's works and similar passages in Mozart's works as well, and Haydn's and so forth. This is a classical cliche almost, this kind of moment when the work just grinds to a halt. It hits a harmonic wall. It cannot go any further, and this is indicated by this characteristic use of the diminished seventh chord here. And then followed by another diminished seventh chord. And so it comes crashing to a halt. These notes they could be taken literally, but they're probably not meant, the lengths of the notes are probably not meant to be taken, I would say they're definitely not meant to be taken literally. For Beethoven to have notated something between the semiquaver and the demi-semiquaver would have been excessively complicated, fussy, and it would have indicated a precision that he was never intending. This is a free moment. It's like a cadenza. Now, in fact, it is possible to play exactly in tempo, because look, these groups of notes, these five notes these five notes in this diminished seventh chord there, and similar in the next bar, they fit in handfuls. They fit under the hand. It's very deliberately arranged by Beethoven like that, so you can play them at whatever speed you want. You can play them as fast as that. You can play them infinitely fast. You can put them all down together. You can play them infinitely fast if you wanted to. And because there's one hand and has the chord, or has the arpeggio, and then the other hand has another arpeggio, which is 4 demi-semi-quavers or 1 quaver later. There is time while you're playing that group to move the other hand into position for the next group. So it's possible to play this at any speed you want. It's possible to play unlimited these notes because they fit in handfuls, because you don't have to move the hand. You don't have to do any thumb under or stuff, any of this technical stuff. You just, that's all there is to it. He's written it in such a way that you can play it at any speed you want, and it's free. It's a cadential moment. It's a cadenza moment, but it wouldn't be. It generally wouldn't be considered correct. It wouldn't be considered within Beethoven's style. It wouldn't be sensible within the style of the piece to just carry on at exactly the same speed. It demands, the musical context demands a big rallentando there, because you've got the pauses at the end of the bars. At bar 164 a pause, and bar 166 is a pause, and you can't just go full tilt at your normal tempo and then stop dead at the pause. That would be ridiculous and unmusical. So that's the answer. Obviously the music shouldn't be played at one tempo. Obviously this is a kind of cadenza. Obviously it's freely interpretable, and it's written in such a way that it could be played, technically it can be played at any speed. So the whole argument, it completely falls down. And this is typical of the arguments that Wim used to support the double beat theory. They just don't hold much water. Another historical, musicological point you can make about all this is that these very fast tempi in works like the Hammerklavier Sonata, these were always known to be difficult. These tempi markings were always known to be problematic, and there are writings from soon after the ink was put on the paper saying, what is this composer doing, writing these fast tempo markings? It's absolutely clear that they were not using some different metronome convention. If you look up Beethoven as I Knew Him by Schindler, and the notes in that by Moscheles, and Moscheles knew Beethoven well and must have heard Beethoven playing and became a great champion of Beethoven's music after his death, and composer in his own right. Moscheles writes that the tempo marking that Beethoven puts on the Hammerklavier, it represents a fearsome presto that surely that clearly isn't right. It's clearly it's not what it's not the intention. And in his edition of the Beethoven sonatas, he marks it to half, but to half what Beethoven marked it. But he does write in this book, Beethoven as I Knew Him by Schindler, he does write that he doesn't think the correct speed is the exact half, and it's also not what Beethoven wrote. It is somewhere on the fast side, but it's somewhere between. It's not what Beethoven wrote, and he's quite clear that he thinks that Beethoven got that wrong. And as a composer, I know that it's very easy to get these things wrong. It's very hard to put a definitive tempo marking on anything. You can never, and they're never definitive. You can never make them definitive, and there's always reconsideration. And when you hear it in actual performance, you reconsider, and it's always got to be negotiated between performers and composers, and it's a malleable thing. And it changes with time. The understanding of what is appropriate and what the true character of a work is isn't necessarily what the composer thought it was. It's not necessarily the composer doesn't have a monopoly on defining the absolute best way of performing his own work. And I say that as a composer, it's always lovely and a great revelation to hear how other people interpret my music. And they may play it faster, they may play it slower, they may find some completely different way of playing it that I never thought of. And when I actually hear it, I think, oh, that's better, yeah, or that's equally good. I'm quite happy for them to do that. And I think, in my experience, that is how composers feel about their creation. Once it goes out into the world, once it's this public property, then we're fine with people doing what they, putting their own stamp and their own personality on it. And that's part of the life of music. And trying to dictate on pieces, this, you've got this metronome mark, this is the correct tempo, this is the authentic tempo, this is how you do it, this is what the composer wanted. This is a deadly thing. This is like squeezing the life out of music, attempting to confine it to one perceived straitjacket way of doing it. Yeah, authentic performance is fine, authentic instruments are fine, attempting to do ornaments and other gestures and markings, attempting to interpret that in a way that's appropriate to the period of the composer, that's all great. But it's all changeable, it's all adaptable, and music lives by applying these changes. So that's what I want to say, that these always take tempo markings with this pinch of salt, always be interpreting them, and the double beat theory, well, it's an interesting concept, but unfortunately, no, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I, for one, will continue to put metronome markings on my pieces, but also put descriptive words indicating what the character of the piece is, which is really perhaps more important, that musicians get that idea of what the character of the piece is, so that they can employ their own imagination and fantasy. Yeah, that's another thing I was going to say about the Beethoven Sonata, going back to the Moonlight Sonata. It says on the first page, it says Sonata quasi fantasia. It's got to be played with fantasy, and that precludes this straitjacket interpretation at a fixed tempo. To interpret a fantasy, obviously, you've got to be doing things to it. So anyway, that's getting back on that hobby horse. Well, this has been a bit of an unusual video for me, but we'll see how it turns out. And thanks very much for watching.